Hey everybody, I hope you're having a good day. Today I wanted to share with you something I read about a guy named John Woolman. John Woolman he was kind of interesting. He belonged to something called the Quaker Church. If you've ever seen like Quaker's oatmeal, think of those guys way back in the day. They made oatmeal, stuff like that, and it's still a business. So I'm not a historian, but they made oatmeal. But so this guy, John Woolman, who was a Quaker, which is actually pretty similar to like Mennonites and Amish people down in the States in like the 1700s. And one of the really bad things that was happening in the States in the 1700s was slavery. Maybe you guys have heard of it. African American people would be sold to farmers and stuff like that to work in the fields, and it was really terrible. It was a terrible thing, and people suffered, and it was just so unjust. But it happened. And John Woolman was actually part of working with churches to get them to stop owning slaves, because unfortunately a lot of Christian people kind of ignored it and didn't think it was wrong, and they came up with reasons to justify it, and they owned slaves, which was a really terrible thing. But John Woolman actually worked with the Quaker Church, and eventually they actually freed all their slaves and stopped keeping slaves even before it was made illegal. So he did a lot of good things that way, and he was a Christian. And so I read about a vision that he had when he was very sick. He had a vision where an angel told him that he had died, and so he was kind of confused. He said he was very scared because he thought he actually did die because he was very sick. And then he saw a vision of slaves mining and working hard and being abused. And the slaves hated God because they had been told that their master that owned them and treated them so badly was a Christian, and that these slaves were working for Christians. And so the slaves said, well, then we don't like Christians, we don't like this God. He must be a bad God, he must be a bad person. And so this made John Woolman very sad, because he knew God and he loved God, but these slaves only knew the God that these Christian slave owners had shown them, and that was a bad experience for them. That was a terrible thing. But so John Woolman was still wondering, why did the angel say I had died? And it's because he said, then he remembered a verse from the Bible in Galatians 2 verse 20. It says, I am crucified with Christ, but still I live, because it's not me that lives, but Christ that lives in me. And that can sound kind of complicated, but we can boil it down to this. It can be kind of simple. So when we are the ones controlling our lives, and we're the ones going out and making decisions, we're going to do bad things because we're sinful people. And that's where things like slavery came from, where you had Christians who, should have been the nicest people and should have been very loving and should never have owned slaves, but they did, because it wasn't Jesus living in them, and it wasn't Jesus making decisions for them, but it was themselves. And so they did awful, awful things. And so when the angel said, John Woolman is dead, and John realized, oh, I'm dead because I'm not physically dead, I'm still alive, but it's God who lives in me, and he lets me see that this is a bad thing, because it's God that is going to make the decisions in my life, and it's God that's going to direct me, and it's God that's going to show me that this is a bad thing that we've done, because we've justified it and we've made it sound okay, but it's not okay. Now, we don't have things like that in North America anymore, but there are still bad things that happen in the world. In lots of poor countries, there are people who are pretty much slaves, who work in factories to create a lot of the things that we actually use here in North America. And I don't want to get into all of that right now, but it's something to consider, that there are still people who really suffer, and there are a lot of people who overlook it. And so what we need to think about is just how, like, the slaves in this vision, and many of them in real life, hated God because their masters said they were Christians. We need to think, what kind of Jesus are we showing people? Are we showing people a Jesus that people would want to know, that people would want to follow? You know, if the only way people knew God was through the way we behaved, would they want anything to do with that God? 2 Corinthians 5 verse 20 says that we are ambassadors of God, meaning that we represent God here on earth, that we are the ones who show people what God is like, and that's a big responsibility. But that is why we have the Holy Spirit, and that is why the Holy Spirit and Jesus, you know, they work through us, and like the verse in Galatians says, he lives in us and he helps us make these decisions. So something that's important to do is every morning pray and ask God, you know, will you work through me today? You know, some people say, you know, your will be done, meaning, you know, God, do what you want to do it this day. Don't let me take control of it. Because we need to give our lives to God and let him be the one making the decisions. So talk about that in your small group today. I hope you guys have a great night, and we'll be praying for you. God bless.